Another episode of the BCRC out of Studio 2880. I'm your host, Dan Ray, and today we're joined by Dale Bumstead, principal of Scion Strategies and the former mayor of Dawson Creek. Thank you very much for joining us, Dale.
My pleasure, Dan. Thank you.
How are you doing today?
I'm really good, thank you. I'm actually in the city of Edmonton this weekend. My grandson's over here playing in the all-native hockey provincial. So we're in the big city of Edmonton enjoying some hockey with our grandchildren. So it's been a good weekend.
Right on. That's great. I'm just gonna start. Why don't you start by describing your new role with Scion Strategies and who you're working with there at the Dene Nations?
Sure. I started, been the mayor of Dawson Creek for about 9 years, and last year I decided that I wasn't going to seek re-election, and then I think everybody's been privy to and heard about the Blueberry River Yehey decision up in Northeast BC, and that was really driven. That legal proceedings was really driven by Blueberry River, and it really dealt with what is referred to as the cumulative effects, the cumulative impacts of resource development in that traditional Treaty 8 territory. And the litigation, the legal case was heard in BC Supreme Court, and it was directed by the presiding justice on it that the Blueberry River were successful in arguing their case that the cumulative impacts of resource development had impacted their treaty rights as guaranteed under that treaty and were given under that treaty to their traditional life of hunting, fishing, and that lifestyle. And so as a result of that, so in the last year and a half, 2 years, there's really been a lot of negotiations going on with the province and Blueberry River, along with the other Treaty 8 nations, because it does impact all of Treaty 8, not just Blueberry. And so I got reached out to by 4 of the Dene Nations, the West Moberly First Nations, Doig River First Nations, Halfway River, and Prophet River First Nations. And they asked me if I would be willing to come to work for them and do some work in regards to some of the initiatives that are coming from that negotiations with the province on initiatives and aspects. And born and raised in the Peace River country, right? My bride and I, we both have lived there our entire life, and so you get that, you get pretty connected in terms of making those connections with government, with local government, with the industry, with business. And I really worked hard over the 9 years that I was the mayor to really try to build those relationships with our Treaty 8 neighbors, and because we're neighbors and we work together and collaboratively, and so they reached out to me and asked me if I'd be willing to come to work for them. And so that really initiated my move from the mayor's role into this new role of working with the Dene Nations. And it's been amazing. It's been really, really educational. It's been informative. It's been a lot of fun, and really to get to know my neighbors and that leadership of those nations and all the nations in a different way has been very, very positive. I'm really enjoying my time.
So you talk about Treaty 8 and the Blueberry River decision. So what kind of work is there to be done coming from that decision and cumulative impacts from industry?
Yeah, Dan, it's a complex kind of process, and it's one of the few treaties really that exist in the province. I was embarrassed really to admit to it that I hadn't read the treaty until about the last year or so. And once you read it and you really understand what the Queen, the Crown had tried to accomplish and sign a treaty with these nations up in Northeast BC, Northwest Alberta, and the corner of Saskatchewan, was really a peace treaty. The Crown knew in 1899 that they were going to try to develop and open the country up for economic benefits, economic opportunities, economic reasons, lumbering, mining, agriculture, tourism, open up the country. And so what the treaty guaranteed them was ensured that they would not impact their right to hunt and fish and live that traditional life. And so the complexities of that has really now driven how do we move forward in a way, respecting that this treaty exists for 125 years, that provides that future for and provided that future for the First Nations, as well as knowing that we need to ensure that the foundation of the litigation was cumulative effects, the cumulative impacts of lumber, of mining, of forestry, of all of those things have impacted that rights under the treaty. And so we know we need to move forward with a resource development in some form, but we also know now that this, and as directed by the courts, that their treaty rights have been violated. And so now it's how do we move forward in a way that we see the economic benefits of resource development in a responsible way, but respecting also now that we need to ensure that the environmental impacts, the habitat restoration, and those protected cultural and sensitive areas that have been there and existed for the millennial, as long as the nation's people have resided on the land in northeastern British Columbia, that those are respected as well. And so it's a different way of kind of looking at how the economy of and the economic impacts of resource development move forward. And traditionally, the provincial government sets the legislation, then they set the regulation, and then the policies for how forestry is going to be handled, and how mining is going to move forward, and how energy is going to be handled, and the natural gas, the energy sector moves forward. And now the courts have realized, and the province have realized, that the treaty also have to be respected in that process. And so my role really is just trying to help facilitate those relationships, be that pipeline of connections to ensure that where we see the opportunities that need to be addressed, that we connect in a really good way, in a positive way, and build those relationships and help to kind of move forward in a very, very good way. You know, we saw it in the caribou recovery and the Southern Mountain caribou. West Moberly and Soto have done an amazing job with the Southern Mountain caribou recovery project, and that was a herd that was threatened under the Species at Risk Act, and so that's had some real negative impacts. And in regards to backcountry enthusiasts, people who like to go up in the mountains, up in the Hassler and Pine Pass and Azueta in that country with snowmobiling, et cetera. And there were some areas that were closed off and restricted, and it really caused some real animosity and real difficulties during that process. And the racism and hatred that was directed at some of the First Nations people, well, it was really unfair in lots of ways, because they're just trying to protect what was guaranteed under treaty, the right to hunt. And those caribou were a part of their life for thousands of years. And so now you see that racism and hatred that escalated. We need to do better than that. And I think that's, for me, how do we facilitate that discussion, that conversation? How do we facilitate that engagement to help ensure that we all understand we can disagree without being really disagreeable? And so that's my role, really, has been trying to help facilitate initiatives and connections and contacts. The Natural Resource Forum was in Prince George here in January. I attended on with the nations, and I reached out to the guide and upfitters. And there's another big organization important to the province and certainly to lots of areas. And making sure we make those real good connections and make sure that we're there to understand that we're there for communicate and have that transparent conversation and discussion, so that it's open and understood by all that we're going to move forward in a good way.
Absolutely. So it's not just facilitating between Treaty 8 nations and government, it's also industry and other outdoors groups that are impacting their Treaty 8 region. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, Dan, honestly, I think, and certainly I struggled with it when I was first elected mayor. It's tough to kind of reach into the nation. Sometimes you feel, a little bit ill at ease. You feel a little bit awkward. You don't want to say the wrong thing. And so sometimes that causes you to hold back a little bit. You don't engage sometimes. And it starts from that foundation of trust as well, right? You want to build that. You got to start from that position of trust. And lots of the First Nations people have had a hard time. We're hearing lots about residential schools, and we're hearing about the 60 scoop and stuff like that. So, there's been some real tough things that have happened in the history of the First Nations people. And so I should have said at the outset, right? I'm a very proud member of the Métis Nation of British Columbia, and so my great grandfather fought at the Battle of Batoche and Duck Lake, and was seriously injured, crippled in that rebellion, and was tried for treason. And so now that I'm learning more about my own history, and you realize that sometimes there's been some real tragedy stuff that's occurred. And I think that's for the nations as well. There's been the First Nations people, there's been some really horrific kind of stories. And so that starting to try to build that trust back. And so I think that's one of the things that I hopefully can bring, is to be able to bring that connection for organizations. BC Cattlemen's Association reached out to me and said, Dale, look, it's part of our future. We want to make sure that we have a strong and good relationship with the First Nations people across the province. And so that's where they feel that, I think there's that, knowing that I'm working for the Dunnies Nations for them, that they feel like there's perhaps an opportunity that I can help facilitate that connection. And I really hope that I can help do that for organizations to be able to build that bridge. We're doing some really cool stuff right now. I'm really, really excited about it with Ducks Unlimited. And so, there's an organization that have a great reputation. They do really, really cool stuff with respect to habitat restoration for waterfowl and for wildlife. And I really think there's an opportunity there for us to try to make those connections with Ducks Unlimited with the nations in a way that you can start to marry and bring together that biology, that science-based approach that Ducks Unlimited have in their organization, and bring it and connect those folks with the elders and the traditional land keepers, the people that have lived on the land, and be able to strategically develop water infrastructure for the habitat, for the waterfowl, for the wildlife. And there's a term we're hearing more and more right now, and it's come as a result of this, is really about heal the land and heal the people. Right. And I think to me, that's part of this reconciliation that we hear about. Right. And that's another kind of an unknown term for folks. What does it really mean? And to me, it's a whole bunch of stuff that we need to do. I kind of got into my head real simply, we must be better and we can be better. And so there's an example of how I think we can facilitate that.
So, of course, it's finding a balance between sustainable development and preserving the environment, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the misconception that we hear lots about from folks is that the nations are not interested in seeing resource development, economic development occur, and they absolutely are. We've used the term responsible development, resource development, for a very long time, and I think now those are easy words to say, but now what does responsible resource development mean? And to me, there's foundational stuff for those that work in the industry. As an example, everybody goes to work every day with a culture of safety, and nobody ever should expect that their worker isn't going to go home safely at the end of the night. But we should have a culture of respect. We should have a culture of integrity. We should have a culture of honesty, and that goes to the land as well as to the people. And to me, the nations, you'll hear it I was at a meeting in Calgary with Chief McCadahey and his council, and with the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers. And Chief made it very clear we're not opposed to development. We just need to know we're moving in a different, new way, respecting that there's the environment, the way we move forward has to be respected, and we need to eat too, and they do, right? The nations rely on economic development for building their community, healthcare, education, culture, language. There's such a big role these guys have, and they've been the one learning for me that, man, these communities of 350, 400 people, and when I was the mayor of Dawson Creek of 13,000 people, I didn't have to worry about education. I didn't have to worry about healthcare or language or culture. And there's these nations and leadership, and they have to build all that. Well, they got to raise some revenue in order to be able to provide those services to their people and their residents. And so I have a huge amount of respect for the work they're doing. But they are not in any way, they are engaged in and absolutely support their responsible development in their traditional territories.
So, what kind of economic outlook is there for the South and the North Peace regions, considering all of this?
Dan, honestly, I think the northeast of BC is just this really amazing resource center, having not just one resource that they can rely on. You get communities that are completely dependent on the forestry sector, or you get other communities that are completely dependent on the mining sector. There's very few that have all three: energy, natural gas, forestry, mining, agriculture. And so the northeast of BC is just an amazing region with all of these resources. You got Tumbler Ridge with the coal mines, you got the forestry sector, both Canfor, West Fraser, as well as Louisiana Pacific. And then you got the energy sector that's really the development of the Montney natural gas reserve that really runs from northwestern Alberta down into Grand Prairie, all the way up through Dawson Creek, Fort St. John, halfway up to Fort Nelson. It is a huge reserve. And why is LNG Canada viable, and why is Coastal GasLink being built from just outside of Dawson Creek to Kitimat, is because it's got a natural gas field that's got the capacity to supply natural gas in huge, prolific volumes for a very, very long time. And I think everybody, obviously, the terms today about climate change and reduce the reliance and dependency on fossil fuels, and I completely understand that, and I think everybody does, but that transition is not going to be done easily, and the world is still required and needing certainly natural gas, and we're seeing that more and more. And this natural gas field we have in Northeast BC is certainly one of the most prolific reserves that exist in North America. Of the five, where you got the Montney in Northeast BC, you got the Duvernay in Alberta, the Marcellus down in Ohio, the eastern states, Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York, and then of course the Eagle Ford and the Permian down in Texas. But the Montney is proving to be very, very strong, as a world class as there is. And so that just bodes very, very well for the region in the upstream development that's going to occur there. And in my opinion, even as you transition off of the fossil fuels, it's still going to be a prominent economic driver for the communities, for the nations, for the region, for the province, for the country. It's just that good. And so, yeah, the region's very good. It's just now, you're just seeing this new world in terms of how do we move forward in a structure, in a process where you now layer in treaty and the rights of the First Nations people to have some input into that as a parallel to the province of British Columbia in the authorization and permitting of development that occurs in that traditional Treaty 8 territory.
And what kind of partnerships are they looking to form? Are they looking to get a piece of the service contracts? Are they looking to be owners, royalties, a mix of all those? What kind of things are the nations asking for?
Yeah, that's kind of outside my bailiwick, really, Dan, in terms of the stuff that I'm engaged in and with the nations to deal with. I think the bigger question is, how does the province of British Columbia, through the regulator, through the BC Oil and Gas Commission or the BC Energy now, how do we ensure we have a structure in place to make sure that there is an approval process, a mechanism to move forward with the approval for permitting as it relates to forestry, as it relates to mining, and as it relates to energy, and ensuring now that you've got this treaty obligation that the courts have identified and said the cumulative effects of development has impacted what was guaranteed in treaty. And so we need to make sure that now the province needs to ensure and find a way to build that forward. And I think, Dan, that's all part of the negotiations that are moving forward. And so I think the nation now in an interim process and the province in an interim process have got some agreements in place. And now the permitting is moving forward in a way, and they're starting to identify that move forward for the benefit of resource development.
That's all really exciting. Do you see major projects in the region starting to have an impact on the First Nations economically or otherwise?
Yeah, I think honestly, I think that the industry see the benefit of partnering with the nations, right? In terms of saying, look, if we're doing some work in the traditional territory of West Moberly, or we're doing some work in the traditional territory of Doig River halfway, then they're wanting to find those ways to facilitate those partnerships with them in a way that benefits both the industry as well as the nations. But again, it's outside my kind of my bailiwick and my lanes, and mine is really about trying to ensure we find ways to facilitate and move forward in a way that we can help to ensure we build strong relationships in the region.
Well, that's all very awesome to hear. I thank you very much for your time. It's so great to hear the work that you're doing with the Duneza, and I appreciate you coming on the show. Thank you very much for your time, Dale.
Yeah, absolutely, my pleasure. Thank you, I will close off. I thank you, and I'm doing my best to learn a little Cree, and so I'll share with you and all of your listeners that First Nations people, when they don't say goodbye, when they say goodbye, they're sending their loved one to the hereafter. And so when we close off, it's Asamina. We'll see you again.
Asamina.
Asamina.
Thank you very much. Well, Asamina, we'll see you again, Dale.
Thank you.